Hello, everyone. I'm Lynn Weaver, and this is Talking Point. Thank you for joining us. Are you a super ager? Let's find out. Despite the changes in cognition that may come with age, older adults can still do many of the things that they have enjoyed their whole lives. Research shows that, for example, older adults can still learn new skills, form new memories, improve their vocabulary and language skills, and retain agility, good health, through mental and physical exercise, thus defying age-related decline in brain power. And that is great. However, let's face it, we all know that for most of us, normal aging affects our bodies as well as our brains. Memory, muscles, vision, smell, and taste, our hearing especially, our sense of touch, smell, taste, seeing, and hearing are not as good as they used to be when we were young. We are slower to find the words we want and recall names. We have more trouble paying attention, and multitasking becomes more challenging. But why? Well, this is what scientists are working hard to unravel. They probe the mystery of aging at the cell level by studying how the brain works. In particular, age-related hearing deficits that affect over 50% of aging adults are an essential part of their studies. One such prominent researcher is Greg Reckenzahn, professor and associate dean of neurobiology, physiology, and behavior at the UC Davis Center for Neuroscience. His research involves understanding the role of the cerebral cortex in interpreting auditory signals and how natural aging affects both the cortical activity and the perception. Professor Reckenzahn and his team's goal is to better understand this complex processing and to determine what aspects of this area are specifically affected by natural aging. To use his knowledge, Professor Reckenzahn wants to help scientists design better hearing aid devices and therapies and prevent or reverse age-related hearing loss. His research is known worldwide, and we are lucky to have him here today to talk to us. Professor Reckenzahn, thank you very much for taking the time. So let's jump in. What happens to the brain when we age?
That's a great question. So, of course, we all know just from looking at our family members that over the course of time, people's brains change, people's personalities change a little bit, how they think and how they respond clearly changes, and that's all based on what's happening in the brain. My expertise is in the auditory system. So what I found was many others is that as you get older, your brain's ability to inhibit signals decreases. And you might think, well, inhibition, is that important? It turns out it's super important. And that means that things are harder to suppress. So for example, when you're talking in a conversation with lots of other people, it's too noisy, right? And it's noisy because your brain isn't able to extract the signal that you're listening to. Yeah. It gets stuck always processing the guy on the table next to you and the waiter and all these other things. So really what happens, I think, in the brain in a nutshell is that it just isn't able to extract the important signals away from the background noise.
There is, before we go into hearing loss, which is your specialty, one of your specialty, I should say, there's a trendy phrase that people use all the time, and that is brain connectivity. Can you tell us what it is?
Brain connectivity. Well, sure. If you think about how the nervous system works, especially in a human, it's based on connections between the simpler parts, and it progresses as you go through the different parts of the cerebral cortex of the brain, and that gives rise to these more complex perceptions. So, for example, in the early visual processing, what the neurons respond to are really simple, like the edge of my shirt here is all
Yes.
they do. And then as you go to the next station and the next and the next and all these different connections, you end up looking at a plaid shirt, and then you look at me in a plaid shirt, right? So it's just the ability to extract more and more sophisticated information. In hearing, initially it just responds to beeps and tones and keys on a piano, for example. And it's not until much later that you can put it all together and understand that I'm actually speaking to you, and the background heater isn't important, and all these kinds of things. And you can take into context, oh, he's explaining brain connectivity, and I'm using my brain connectivity to understand what it is that he's trying to explain.
We'll get into this a bit later. I want to know the differences between people who have more brain connectivity than other, if you can really study that. I'm not sure. But what I want to ask you is also, what type of experiments do you do to understand hearing loss? I know that you've been working with monkeys, but tell us more, please.
Yeah, so the experiments that I do, I look at young and old people and other animal models. And what I am trying to understand is what part of the hearing loss is giving rise to these perceptual deficits that are most devastating to the individual. So we talked about speech and noise, and that's a big one. So being able to understand what people are saying is super important to people, right? That's what we do. We strive to communicate with each other, and we do it mostly by speech and in language, right? As opposed to now we text more and we email, but really you want to sit there and have a conversation, sort of like what we're doing right now, even though it's Zoom. Right. And so the question is it because in the cochlea in your ear, you can't hear the sounds? Is that what's giving you the limitation? And if that's all it is, then oftentimes a hearing aid will really help, right? So you can boost that signal, and then you can hear fine, and then you can go ahead and process speech. So we're looking at the hearing deficit, the hearing loss as one aspect, but there's also the hearing deficit. So people and animals that have normal hearing, so the audiogram, they can hear all the tones fine, but they and they're older, but they still can't understand the complicated ones, okay, like speech. Okay, so that's an aging deficit. So that would be an age-related hearing deficit, because the hearing levels are fine. It's just that they can't process the sound in order to understand what is happening. And it's not just, oh, I can't hear the individual sounds or the notes or the frequencies. It's also, I can't put them together. I can't process them fast enough, basically, so that I can understand that each of these syllables and each of these words all work together to make up a whole sentence.
Well, Greg, this is so true, or should I say Professor Regenson? This is so true, because very often not very often, but aging people generally say, well, they'll say, oh, I can hear what you say, but I can't understand.
Right.
And
that's exactly right.
Is that because, as you said, there's a time lag perhaps between the hearing, or is it something else? Tell us.
Well, time lag is a way of thinking about it, but really what happens, I think, and it's still up in the air, so I could be wrong, but what I think is happening is it's the ability to parse out the different words into words and into sentences that is really struggling. There's a little bit of memory involved. So if you have a long run-on sentence, we both know, even when you're younger, if it's blah, 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 you kind of lose the thread. So you have to be fairly concise. But it's the ability to go ahead and put together in your mind what exactly is being said. So one example that I like to use is if your listeners parse up this interview into individual words, right? Even though you think you understood every word that I said when you listen to it live, you might make some mistakes, right? But what happens when I'm talking to you or you're listening to somebody else is you make a model of what are they talking about? And if you have you heard sped or read, and you couldn't really tell, you can put it into context and you don't even consciously are aware of this. You think, oh, he must have said red, right? Because that would have made sense because I was talking about your boss, right? So you just go ahead and do that. As you get older, you make more and more of those mistakes because of these age-related hearing deficits. And so your cognitive model starts to break down, right? And the next thing you know, after a long conversation, the aged listener thinks that they're talking about something completely different, right, than what they really are, because they've been making more and more mistakes that are cumulative at the end of the day. And then, so what do? Then you ask a ridiculous question because you didn't understand what was going on, right? And you feel foolish, right? And you feel stupid. And the other talker is going, oh, Gramps, what are you doing? You can't hardly talk to him. And that leads to the isolation, which just exacerbates the whole thing. So
Yes.
I think this is a long-winded answer. Hopefully you remembered the first part.
No, it's very interesting, Craig. Actually, there is a silly example that comes to mind, but I mention it because hearing loss brings isolation, and you said this before. And so the goal of your research is really to help society and aging adults, right? But there is an anecdote. My father-in-law had very poor hearing, and once he was asked at a dinner table, whom did you vote for? And his answer came back, can I have another piece of apple pie? And that made everybody laugh, but he felt very uncomfortable. There is something else I wanted to ask you, and this is a broader question that I think nobody really has an answer yet. Why is it that some people age more and more quickly than others?
That is a $1 million question. It's the fountain of youth question, really. And there's a couple of ideas. Well, the corollary to that, of course, is why do turtles live to be 150 and mice live to be 1 year old? What's the difference in their molecular structures or whatever it is? How do some species live long and others live short? So that's a question that's still out there, and I don't think anybody understands very well. Why are some people much older at 70 than others? Why are people very old at 80 and others are still very vibrant? Part of it, I think, is genetic luck, sort of like the turtle versus the mouse, and you can go only so far genetically, but also it's activity. Okay, what you really need to do is keep your brain active, and that goes all the way back to my graduate work. Use it or lose it. It's very popularized now, and it's true that if you use your brain doing important things or interesting things, then you keep your connections very strong and your brain connectivity stays high and you stay engaged and you age much better. The other thing, of course, is exercise is enormously important in the aged. So the more you exercise, you're going to lose muscle mass. That just happens as you get older. But if you can stay engaged and exercise, it's not just the cardiovascular fitness and all that, which is also very, very good, but it keeps the brain much healthier. So exercise is great. And the last thing that I'll say that really helps people with aging is to be engaged in either most conversation, right, with others. So that the social aspect is important. Learning a new language is very helpful, and learning a new song on an instrument is very helpful. So musicians, for example, seem to have much better aging profiles than non-musicians, for example.
That's very interesting, Professor Regenson. I like that. Of course, I'm not a musician, so I'll have to compensate. And that brings us to another question, if I may. Is aging well also compensating for your deficits? Would you say that is something that works?
Well, I think anything that you do that keeps your brain engaged to keep on understanding speech in noisy environments is going to be a good thing. Now, by compensation, if you mean, can I ask the person I'm having the conversation with, can you please talk a little more slowly or a little more loudly? That's great, right? If you start to have age-related hearing loss in your ear, it's a good idea to put in the hearing aids so that your brain still keeps getting signals from those high frequencies that you're starting to lose. And that just activates more and more of your brain. So any kind of compensation that you can use to keep you from spiraling in the other direction, right? So if you're embarrassed about wearing a hearing aid or embarrassed about asking someone to repeat themselves, and you reply to who you voted for with a slice of apple pie, you end up being embarrassed, not really wanting to do those social situations anymore, watching TV, not the same, right? You might be listening to the characters, but you're not engaged, right? You're just kind of, you're not doing all the things that your brain does when it's being active by something interesting.
That's very good advice, and it's scientific advice as well, but it works. Now, a personal question. What got you into this field? Is there any particular, did you like your professor? Do you have any particular background reason for choosing this?
I'm happy to tell you, it's to be in the field of neuroscience, to be that broadly based. It was basically because I was a sophomore in college, and I had grown up here in Northern California, but my parents had moved to Spokane, Washington during my freshman year. And I spent my after freshman summer in Spokane, Washington, where I didn't know anybody. It wasn't that much fun for me. And I was going to UC San Diego, and San Diego is a great place to be 19 years old. So I thought to myself, I need a job so that I can, stay over the summer in San Diego, not have to go home. And so I looked at the job board. I was a bio major, and there was a lab there, and they worked on these salamanders called axolotls. And my first job in science was to change their water and take care of the axolotls in this laboratory. But when I was in the lab, there was professors and postdocs and students doing science, and people that were like me, just a little bit older, and they were doing really, really interesting things. And I thought, this is for me. If you can get paid for doing this, this is going to be a great job, right? So from there on, I was just dedicated to I want to be a neuroscientist, right? And I've been doing that ever since. So since 1982, when I first went to Bill Harris's laboratory, I think he's retired now. Went off to Cambridge. He's a very famous scientist, but I was really just fortunate to be this young, dumb kid and get into a great lab and get to experience, neuroscience firsthand.
And you continue to be very successful in doing what you do, and you love it. And I hope you get paid for it too.
More than I used to, but yeah, I would do it. I don't tell the boss, but I would do this for free.
Well, I'm sure the boss knows. And that's why scientists are so successful. And so it's so wonderful that humanity, if you like, can benefit from your dedication. So thank you. One last question, which I think is maybe, again, we don't really have an answer, but you mentioned it once, so it's your fault that I bring it up. Longevity has increased exponentially since the last millennium. It's part of the evolution. Do you think the brain has anything to do with it?
In the sense that, well, our brains have changed and so now we live longer? I think probably not. In the sense that we have the opportunity, given that we stay healthier longer because of modern medicine, just in general. I mean, it used to be a geriatric fell and broke their hip and died in a few weeks of pneumonia or whatever afterwards, right? So we're overcoming that. And I think that the way the cultural evolution of humans, and Americans especially, has worked is, the way that that's worked is that we keep our brains engaged longer, right? So we're more able to, through Zoom, through telephones, through a lot of opportunity, a lot of extra money, so we can afford to go get a coffee, right? And do these kinds of things that humans just love to do. So I think staying active is really the key. And Americans especially seem to be doing that longer than they used to back, the 1900s.
Mm-hmm. So it has nothing to do with the morphology of the brain. It hasn't.
I think that if you looked at a human brain from 1700 and you did the histology and you looked at the connections, I think they would be remarkably similar. I don't think you'd say, oh, look, this is the modern one. It takes evolution way too long to actually change things like that. So you can see the difference between Neanderthal. I mean, go back 5 million years and see a difference to Australopithecus, but you can't go back hundreds of years. Christopher Columbus's brain and my brain pretty much look the same.
Anything else you like to add and share with us?
Just one thing, and every time I talk to anybody about my work and how age-related hearing loss and hearing deficits work, is I implore you that when you're talking to an elderly person with these kinds of deficits, that you should probably speak a little bit more loudly, but not that necessarily very much loudly. If you have a higher pitched voice, it's usually better to get a little lower pitch if you can. So men are easier to understand than little children, for example. Mm-hmm. And the most important thing is to slow down. And by slowing down, what I want you to do is not just slow down. Okay. Mm-hmm. What I want you to do is take little longer pauses between words. So just pause between words as opposed to slowing everything down. Okay. If you can do that with an elderly person, turn off the TV, get one-on-one, do that. They will tell you fascinating things about how the world used to work and how they think. And it's really well worth your effort.
That's great. That's very good advice. Well, Professor Rickenson, it was a pleasure to have you on the show. And thank you so much.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.